This is the Sultanat podcast, and you're listening to me, Mohammed Faisal. In this episode, we are going to discuss Lal Ded, also known as Laleshwari, who is a revered mystic and poet from 14th century Kashmir. Her verses or vaakhs blend Shaivism and Sufism, reflecting deep spirituality and the human quest for truth. Lal Ded wandered the valleys of Kashmir, sharing wisdom that transcended religious boundaries. In this episode, we explore her life and teachings, unraveling the myths surrounding her and delving into the politics of translating her work. Stay tuned.
My name is Dean Accardi. I am a professor of history at Connecticut College with a focus on Sultanate period Kashmir.
Hi, my name is Shakir Mir, and I'm a freelance journalist based in Srinagar. I was previously a correspondent with an Indian national publication, and now I am also I'm writing on history, culture, human rights, and law.
So today we have Dean with us, who is an expert on Lal Ded. He's done a phenomenal job on Lal Ded and trying to understand who she was and the kind of work that was created around her, and also has a very critical outlook on the works that have emerged in the early 20th century. So let's talk to Shakir first, so that our listeners understand why Lal Ded is so central to Kashmir's spiritual compass and why is she still in vogue to this day in our society.
Okay, so basically, the the very important thing about Lal Ded is that she occupies a very liminal space between the Hindu period that is said to have lasted until the mid 14th century and the beginning of the Sultanate period. When we talk about in academics, or even the popular representations in the media or the Bollywood, when we talk about Kashmir's transition from the Hindu period to Muslim period, we talk about in terms of a certain rupture, as though it was a Hindu period a day before, and the next day, some sort of Muslims forced their way in and established their own supremacy in the region. That is absolutely contrary to how the history has unfolded in Kashmir. There was a considerable this gray area between the two religious orders, two religious philosophies, and during the concluding years of the Hindu period, or although I should not be periodizing the history like that, but because now that frameworks are already set and we understand the history in these terms, I'm just doing it for the benefit of our audience. Otherwise, it's typical of the Orientalist narratives of periodization of history of the Indian subcontinent, because what we classify as Hindu rule or Muslim rule, they are not very solidified, sort of totally walled off categories with no interactions with each other. So there is a considerable sort of osmosis between these two periods. So when we talk about this transition from to Hindu to Islamic period, we're talking about a great amount of years and centuries that have taken, the time that has passed in between these two periods, where a lot of cultural exchange has taken place, and also within the society a lot of changes have taken place. For example, a lot of academics have dealt with this period in their books. We have Ratnalal Hanglu's A State in Medieval Kashmir. We have Muhammad Ashraf Wani, Islam in Kashmir from 14th to 16th century. Books like these have been written already that explore how the kind of situation that existed when Kashmir was transitioning towards Islam. So during the concluding years of the Hindu rule, we clearly get an idea how the Hindu religion itself was transforming. The rise of the kind of Shaivism that had flourished during those concluding years, was a form of protest against the established order, because people were society was upset. It was driven by the social disharmony. There were dissensions everywhere. Landed elites were also called as damaras. They were rising and they were protesting. They would turn to violence to make sure that their demands are put, to make sure that things happen on their terms. So we see the concluding years of Hindu period characterized by remarkable, by a certain degree of social unrest and economic crunch and other things. It is in this period that we see the emergence of a what I call as a protest movement against the extant order. Lal Ded actually embodies this protest. Her if you see her verses, we cannot make sense of Lal Ded if we are not able to locate her in the context of her time. She emerges in this context. That's why her verses are like that. She's denouncing the idol worship. She's saying that people do not trust me and I don't need their trust, and she's railing against the people, and it seems that she is the flag bearer of this protest movement, and she, as a woman, she's going against this entire whatever the social religious structures were there at that time. So what we see eventually, is that while she was neglected by the Brahminical order at that time, it is instead the Muslims who are appropriating her, who describe as her as Lala Arifa or Rabia Sani, the second Rabia of Basra. These are the descriptions that we get in the writings where we find the earliest mention of Lal Ded, which is of course Tazkiratul Arifin. So it's very important to understand what this period was, and how it impacted whatever the articulations, the utterances of Lal Ded. Because unless we understand the period, it makes no sense to understand the Lal Ded then. So understanding her poetry as protest movement against the extant order, that's what will allow us to understand what Lal Ded was all about.
So what you're saying, Shakir, is that the relevance of Lal Ded is also because of like the like the Kashmiri habit of speaking truth to power. Because I remember in 2019, this verse that is attributed to Lal Ded, which is "Asi erst, asi are, so we were and we shall be," it kind of reframed the entire movement when it, even though it was very silent in that sense. So, Dean, my question to you is, what's behind the myth making of Lal Ded? Because when I was kid growing up, I heard about this incident where she was naked, and then she jumped into this baker's oven, and then she came clothed, and she could only appear like that to Shah Hamdan, Said Mir Said Ali Hamdani. The question that I have is, these legends that have been created around her, and these verses that still continue to ring in our popular culture. What's behind the myth making, as someone who has a very critical sense of understanding Kashmir and Lal Ded's poetry?
Thank you. Yeah, I think this is an important question to try to, I guess, get a grasp on who Lal Ded is. And I would say that in many ways, we don't actually know much about her unto herself. What we do know are things that people have written about her. So we have, she most likely existed. Seems like she would live from sometime in the first couple decades of the 1300s and until the sometime in the last few decades of the 1300s. And but beyond that, it's very hard to get to her because she didn't write anything down. And in fact, the first time we ever see anything written about her is, as mentioned by Shakir, Muhammad Ali Reina's Tazkirat al-Arifin towards the end of the 16th century, the 1580s. And so I would say the most important thing to get from that is to see that she is functioning in one way or another in order to serve various purposes of those who talk about her, write about her, try to invoke her. And so along those lines, it seems like Shakir was bringing up, for some, she becomes a figure of a kind of protest movement, that she is somehow railing against those who are in religious or political authority at a time. And so this, holds a certain valence where she kind of comes up again when there is upheaval or sense of corruption or domination, either religiously or politically. She seems to be invoked again and recalled and talked about and revived. At the same time, she seems to be a figure that's kind of simultaneously functioning as a how to say it, somebody who has something to say on a situation and yet somehow doesn't have a stake in it herself. I mean, in many ways, I think this is a gendered situation in which, she's considered this great ascetic saint. She's, like Nandrashi and like others who are out there, walking around, eating almost nothing, wearing minimal clothing or maybe no clothing, and all these sorts of things out in the world. And so, in my own looking at these earlier periods, that she seems to be someone who can then say, oh, this saint is greater than that saint, or this, ascetic is more powerful and has more miraculous abilities than that one, because somehow she's not in the competition because she's a woman, and so therefore is, able to be the kind of arbitrator and judge of these sorts of things. Because if any other saint says, oh no, there, I can tell you who the best saint is, and it's me, that then people are like, oh, of course you're going to say that. And so I think even when then you get to the 19th century, that you then have ideas around, oh, what is Kashmir's identity? What is Kashmir's culture? Oh, well, she is an important figure in that. And so we want to attribute to her what we want to attribute to Kashmir as a whole. So, you can have this as a kind of, oh, we've always been a protesting the people speaking back to power type of person, or you have the Dogras themselves appropriating her and trying to talk about this, that Kashmir has a Hindu heritage. That's Kashmir's true heritage is its Hindu heritage, and oh, okay, so that goes to the medieval period, and then there's this time in which Muslims are rulers. Oh, so then what do we do about that? Oh, she's this link between the medieval period and the modern period. Oh, she's the one that carried on the tradition, or there's various ways in which she seems to be constantly being brought up and used for some other purpose by those people who are commemorating her or writing about her.
So, Dean, my question is, what was the need of, let's say, the Muslim Sufis who kind of, you know, turn the society upside down because through Islam? What was the need for the Muslim saints uh, like in Muhammad Ali Raina's Tazkiratul Arafin? Why does he have to write about Lal Ded? Because it's very much easy for them to not really write about her and continue on this tradition of the other saints that established the foundation of Islam and through Sufism. So, what was the need of bringing Lal Ded? What was the bridge that they were trying to create?
Good. Yeah. I mean, that's an important question. And I think, one thing that needs to be said is and remembered is that in the kind of Sultanate period, and for, I would say, much of, from the 12th or maybe 13th century to the 18th century, Sufism was the major institutional force behind Islam. That even when there were ulama and whatnot who were not, Sufis themselves, a lot of the writings, the literature, the kind of tropes, the kind of ways of understanding the world were in many ways deeply influenced by Sufis. And so in Kashmir at the time, there was definitely a competition amongst various Sufi orders to become predominant and have an alliance with the court and have very powerful nobles connected to them. But also that one of the ways in which these various Sufi groups competed with one another was to compete for their legitimacy, that we are more directly connected to the Prophet, or more directly connected to major saints in our various lineages and whatnot. And so you have a lot of these Sufi groups all trying to claim Ali Hamadani as their Sufi order being the heirs to Ali Hamadani, because he was such an important figure. But also for the Suhrawardi order, and the Suhrawardis, Muhammad Ali Raina's Tazkirat al-Arifin, Muhammad Ali Raina himself was a Suhrawardi Sufi, and the Suhrawardi order in Kashmir was in many ways started by a very, not famous saint, who then, initiated Sheikh Hamza Maktoum, who then becomes big. But then if you wanted to claim, oh, I am this major saint, or his disciples wanted to claim he was a major saint, you'd have to somehow bolster him in some way to give him more legitimacy or lineage or power. And so Lal Ded functions in two ways along those lines. So one, Lala in some ways in these accounts in Muhammad Ali Raina's writings is in some ways representative of Kashmir itself. She seems to have had a certain cachet of respect amongst Kashmiris. And so to say that somehow the Suhrawardi order and Hamza Maktoum are connected to her is to give him legitimacy amongst a Kashmiri populace for whom she might be more famous. But also because she lived in this time period in which Ali Hamadani was there shortly, in the 14th century, but also this famous Suhrawardi saint, Maktoum Jahania, lived during the 14th century as well. Now, it is unlikely that he, in fact, came to Kashmir himself personally, but many of the stories given are about her interactions directly with him. And then when, after both of them pass away in the 14th century, from beyond the veil, from a spiritual realm, Lal Ded returns and ends up teaching Hamza Maktoum, ends up teaching Muhammad Ali Reina himself directly from the spiritual realm. And so if you were to trace their lineage, instead of saying, oh, okay, Reina was taught by Sheikh Hamza Maktoum, and Sheikh Hamza Maktoum was then taught by this kind of obscure, not very important saint, and then whatever, instead to say, no, there's actually a more important lineage that Hamza is directly connected to Maktoum Jahania through one link, Lal Ded. And that she, being an important person already, then kind of even amplifies that link even further. So I think in some ways she serves both to garner a certain type of Kashmiriness to the sainthood and a popularity amongst Kashmiris, but also to tie it back to Maktoum Jahania and be able to claim a more powerful lineage than maybe Sheikh Hamza Maktoum himself had.
Would you say that this is kind of similar to how the Rishi order links itself to OIS al-Qarni because of their that rivalry that they had with the Sayyids at that time? Is it kind of similar to how Hamza Maktoum and other saints wanted to have a more Kashmiri-centric, Rishi order-centric view of their lineage, and they used Lal Ded and then Nundresh and others? Would it be correct to say that?
Yes, absolutely. So I think that's the other very important thing to bring in is that Lala is most well known for being connected to Nundreshi. And so because those two kind of are a pair in the mind of many people, that then the Rishi order was obviously a very powerful, important, revered order in Kashmir. And also popularly, that they were, they didn't gain their legitimacy because of their ties to a court or because they, came from Persia or something like that. They were important because they were out in the countryside amongst the people, but also engaging in all sorts of ascetic activity to prove their piety and so on and so forth. And so Lala being directly connected to them as well is a way to then tie the Suhrawardi order to the Rishis as well. And so that's very important. And you bring up the oases, and this is something that I think is an important key to what is happening in kind of the Sultanate period Kashmir, is that there's arguments made by Daud Khaki and others that seem to privilege this idea of being an oasis, that somebody who is initiated into their Sufi order or spiritual practice through a dream, through some contact with a being in a spiritual realm, instead of it being through a person, a physical person, a known Sufi saint who is initiating you. And that in some ways today, there's a kind of reversal of what was clearly important in the, say, 16th century, that today if somebody says, oh, I'm a Sufi saint, or I'm not a saint, but I'm a Sufi and I was initiated through a dream, that's the only legitimate lineage I have, people then, look at them a little suspiciously saying, oh, so you actually don't have a real teacher. You don't have a real lineage. You are just, making things up. And then in order to justify it, say you got it from a dream. Whereas in the 16th century and with these Sufi orders, there seems to be this privileging of saying, oh, well, how are you gaining spiritual teachings? Through a physical person that, that's already so material, so crass. And then furthermore, through actual physical language that someone's trying to communicate with you. Oh, we all know we stumble with language all the time. Whereas if you're getting a spiritual teaching directly from soul to soul, oh, then you know that's a real teaching from a real spiritual being from whose lineage is directly connected because they can communicate from the spiritual realm. That seems to be more legitimate. And so again, that Sheikh Hamza Maktoum got his teachings from Lal Ded through the spiritual realms, like, that's important. And that the rishis claim that they're primarily an Owaisi order because they received their initiation, or Nand Rishi received his main spiritual teachings not from a physical person, but from the spiritual realm, is a claim to power instead of a kind of excuse for not having another legitimate avenue of power or knowledge.
Yeah, I think it kind of also magnifies these saints like Hamza Maktoum or Nunreshi because one, they have had a physical teacher because they were scholars of Islam, but at the same time to have this mystical nature of teaching, like it it occurred to them in a dream, or the soul to soul connection that you were talking about, it just adds a lot more power. And given like the circumstances that Kashmir was in the 15th and 14th century, it's kind of plausible that people would see them as, let's call them like superhuman beings in that sense. Would
Yes,
that
absolutely.
be?
Yes, my question was regarding the nakedness of Lalla. Both the Sanskrit sources, as well as the Muslim, the Persian sources, refer to Lalla being without clothes, and whereas the Hindu sources actually celebrate her, Muslim sources does so too, as you talk in your paper, but they had a different way of coming around to that fact. So could you explain, Dean, how the Muslims, despite their obvious the Muslimness and the Islamic culture, all the trappings of the Islamic culture and Islamic moral value system that was there, how did they reconcile with this element of Lalla?
Yeah, no, this is an important question as well. I mean, there is something telling that in that kind of revival in the late 19th, early 20th century around Lala, that there was a lot of discomfort around the idea that she was this naked saint. And in fact, some people said, oh no, that was a mistranslation. Actually, it was about her dancing. This wasn't about her being naked. But yeah, as you say, these earlier sources do all make this very clear that they're like, this isn't just one word that's been mistranslated. There's like whole accounts that go on and on about how she's not wearing any clothes, and this in fact it serves as a hinge point in narratives about her, so that in two of the accounts of Muhammad Ali Reina, it's made very clear that she was naked. In that one of the first stories, it's about her walking down the road. And Nandrishi is there, and he's engaging in a kind of visualizing Abdul Qadir al-Jilani in his head as a spiritual practice. And as she passes by, she suddenly grabs cloth and clothes herself. And Nandrishi, is very confused and doesn't, is kind of wondering why she's clothing herself. So there already we can tell, well, in order for that to be a plot point, she has to be naked if this is to make any sense. And that Nundrashi didn't even need to say anything because she is so advanced in her spiritual powers that she can read what's in the mind and heart of Nundrashi and says, no, don't worry, this makes sense because I'm clothing myself because when you're in the presence of a great spiritual being, of such great, intense masculinity like Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, that you need to cover yourself. You need to veil yourself, cover your head. And so I am doing that here. And likewise, therefore, when you engage in such visualization practices, that if you encounter somebody who is, of such great, powerful masculinity, you too should be covering yourself. And so this is an interesting moment, I think, in part to explain why maybe at the time there were certain visualization practices and that people might have covered themselves in the midst of that practice. And they would say, why would you do that? Oh, well, here's an explanation why. And so it's very interesting to see, on the one hand, there's a very clearly the kind of breaking the norms of gendered behavior, and at the same time very much reinforcing the fact that there are these standards of gendered behavior, that it's considered odd that she's walking around naked, and that she then, and this is about masculinity, and that maybe, I can see how much later this story about Lala running away upon seeing Ali Hamadani and going into an oven and then coming out fully clothed in green clothes is something that only appears in the historical record much later, centuries later. But seems to have a similar sort of thing, this idea of like, oh, around great masculinity, you have to cover yourself before that power. And so even so, I said there's another account of Lala in Muhammad Ali Reina's writings in which it's directly talking about her nakedness. And it says, yes, she was naked. And that this was something that was, that some in the community were questioned or disturbed by. And then it's a very kind of, how to say, cryptic writing that it says, but in fact, no one could actually see her nakedness, because in the same way that in the day the sunlight shields the sight of the stars, likewise, Lala's nakedness was shielded from those who are unworthy or unable to see the truth. And so it's, again, simultaneously acknowledging that she must have been naked, and yet at the same time, there's this idea of like, well, if any casual man could see her naked, doesn't that have a certain power dynamic? And so they're addressing that, saying, no, they couldn't actually see her nakedness. And so, again, there's a way in which I think there's actually a deeper whole conversation about Islamic practice around who is powerful, who is not, what are the types of protocols you should have around various people, and who has status over whom is being played out through these stories, very much through all sorts of gendered language and lenses and frameworks. And that Lala then functions as a kind of figure to speak of all of those types of social hierarchies that can be mapped through gender ideas, and then understood as understanding the larger social structures.
I think one important thing that Shakir and Dean, you also touched upon is, her being against these social hierarchies and power orders, because she has written so much against caste, clergy, against the religious establishment.
Yeah, I mean, this is a difficult question to answer because, as I wrote in my Orientalism and the Invention of Kashmiri Religions article, there's this problem that in many ways it is assumed the stories about who Lal Ded really was is, this very Trika Shaiva, woman drawing from the greats like Abhinavagupta centuries earlier, but that she's actually speaking in some vernacular, in the Kashmiri vernacular, and therefore making it popular and speaking to the public and so on and so forth. But in fact, her poetry doesn't show up until the 17th century, the end of the 17th century, maybe early 18th century, possibly. And so this idea of she is first and foremost a Shaiva Bhakti poet saint, and then secondarily revered by Muslims as this ascetic woman. It's, at least in my, from everything that I've seen and dug into the archives, it in fact is inverted, that we in fact see first that she is first revered by these Sufis towards the end of the 1500s, and then maybe was kind of reclaimed by certain Hindu groups. Of course, you can say, well, there's, no, that in fact she was revered amongst Hindus the whole time, and we only have it recorded later. It was all oral. But as a historian, I feel like I can't tell you what the oral record was. I can tell you that in these early writings, there's no mention of her having any poetry. That usually, even if the poetry itself isn't recorded, if someone is known for being a great poet, they would mention that she was a poet, but being a poet isn't mentioned at all. So that's, to me, seems to indicate, oh, maybe the poetry came later. That being said, she also isn't necessarily clearly a Muslim either. She's very ambiguous in these early writings, that she's receiving teachings from these Sufis and passing them on to other Sufis, and even getting kind of the ijazat to pass on these teachings, and yet is never said to have converted to Islam. And at the same time, they're not, these Muslim writings don't talk about her having any particular Hindu practices, but they say that she is kind of Kashmiri and was this, powerful saint before she even meets any of these Sufis. So who is she? Where is she getting her power from? Where is her spiritual grounding? What's her religious identity? In fact, is very ambiguous in these stories. And in fact, maybe this distinction between Hindu and Muslim is not as sharp as it is for us today, in which these communities and communalism is much more significant. At the time, I think there was a usefulness to her being ambiguous, being connected to both the Suhawardis and the Rishis, but also to non-Muslims and kind of local Kashmiri traditions, Hindu or otherwise, that they want to maintain this kind of ambiguity around her. And it's very clear that Nund Rishi is a figure that's standing outside of certain types of Muslim hierarchies. And so her being this kind of pushback against a certain type of ulama is an important thing to kind of bring in, that maybe she's bolstering that side as well.
Okay, so basically my question was about Dean's paper, a very important paper that he wrote a couple of years ago. And I was going through the paper yesterday also, and I came across very interesting bits. Dean makes a very interesting observation. He says that the Gerson and Barnett, who were the authors of the Lalwak, they invert the evidence, just like he explained a couple of minutes ago, by privileging the recent poetry over the older hagiographies that were there by the Persian authors, by constructing an argument for the reliability of the oral transmission in Kashmir. But later, Dean also says that that reliability is quite unreliable. That reliability of oral transmission does not sound to be very convincing. I wanted to kind of understand what did he observe to conclude that this argument is very unconvincing.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, that one of the issues around the kind of collection of the Lala Vakyani, as it's been published in under Grierson and Barnett, the translation into English with the help of Mukundram Shastri, that this collection is kind of subtly argued by Grierson and Barnett to be a kind of canon of Lal Ded's poetry, or if not the canon, at least one canon of it. And what I found in the archives is that that you would think, like, if you were going to say something was a canon, you would then go through and say, okay, we got hundreds of these sorts of things. Okay, we whittled it down, figured out some of these are fake, some of these were invented later, some of these were actually written by somebody else and falsely included into this collection. We kind of sifted through them and got to what we think was conclusively the core. And even Grierson, says at one point, is like, oh, you can see these old Kashmiri forms of speech linguistically, and him being a linguist, people, go along with this and are like, okay, yeah, you're the linguist, what are older forms, and so maybe more reliably going back to somebody who spoke in the 14th century. But in fact, we find the opposite, that what we see is that Mukundram Shastri, working with Grierson, that he went and collected from all sorts of kind of traditional reciters of Lala's poetry and collected as much as he could, wrote them down, wrote commentaries explaining all of the language involved, and helped translate these into English and sent these to Grierson a little bit along the way. But his largest collection, he collected over 300 of these poems, and then his house burnt down. And these were lost. And at this point, Grierson said, well, we have a publication date already set up. We already have, everything is moving along. We don't have time to restart this all over again. Mukundram, you need to get this back and to us as soon as possible. So he says, okay, I'll try to do what I can, reproduces only a little over 100 poems and sends these to Grierson. And then Grierson says, okay, this is the canon. And so there's a way in which it's clear that for Mukundram Shastri even, that if he was writing all of these commentaries, doing all of this meticulous work for over 300 poems, that he thought that those were legitimate as well. And so there wasn't a sifting process. It was just what we could recollect in a short period of time. And that Grierson even kind of indicates this in, if you were to read the Lala closely, which I, do for this article, that even though he makes this argument, oh, this is a, perfect passing down of oral tradition from the 14th century till today, this is a canon that we can see, so on and so forth, that then in the appendix he says, oh, these types of old forms of Kashmiri are actually reproduced all the time in recent poetry to make it sound older and things like that. And you're like, wait, if people are writing in this form now, how do we know that this wasn't written by somebody 30 years ago and attributed to Lala, but put it in a kind of old sounding style? So it starts falling apart very quickly. And yet Grierson, so I think then you're like, why is Grierson doing this? Why is he wanting to prop this up as a canon and so on and so forth? And in fact, that what he then uses to kind of check the poems for legitimacy is to actually go to the written archive and then knows we have two of the earliest manuscripts were collected by Sir Mark Orlstein, that was then added to the India Office collection and whatnot, and that those were the ones that I was mentioning from at the earliest late 17th century. And so kind of relatively later written down. And then he's like, oh, if the poem's both in there and is one of the ones collected, well, then we know that one's a good one. That one must be for sure. So there's a way in saying, oh no, the oral record is more reliable than the written record, and yet we're using the written record to affirm that the oral ones are correct. It's, this a tautology. It's methodologically dubious. And so why would he do all these things? Well, in part, it's because Grierson and Orientalists like him were invested in this chronology that Shakir brought up early on, this idea that, oh, well, the actual foundation of Indic civilization is Hinduism, and that Hindu civilization is its basis, and then later there is this rebellion of the Jains and the Buddhists, and then it falls into a dark ages of Muslims, and then the British are here to recover and bring this civilization back to its golden age because they share these Aryan roots with white Europeans. Like, it's a deeply racist, European supremacist idea of Orientalism, that it's like, oh, this Hindu golden age of the past is only a golden age because Indo-European languages tie us together. And so we must have been one people at one time. So we must have all been part of this kind of Indo-European Aryan heritage. And therefore, the glory of ancient India is in fact the glory of ancient Europe because of this connection. Otherwise, it would have been derided with so many other civilizations or groups that they've, have records of in earlier past as being completely below European civilization. So you have all of this investment in an idea of the Hindu past is tied to the European past, and therefore we need to find things that affirm greatness in that, and that Muslims at best can be seen as later assimilating or appropriating these cultures, or that they're foreigners that don't belong here and need to go away. And so all of that then not only supports Orientalism, but also supports certain types of Hindu supremacy in South Asia, whether that is more recently under Hindu nationalism, or going to the Dogras, who are, rulers over Kashmir because they bought it from the British, who won it in the First Anglo-Sikh War. And so their legitimacy of rule over Kashmir is profoundly dubious. So they kind of anchor their boat to this idea of like, oh, Kashmir used to be Hindu, so we are the continuance of Hindu kingship over Kashmir, and therefore we're going to establish a research and publications department to publish all of these Sanskrit texts from the 10th century and 11th century and so on and so forth. That is what's key to promote as being Kashmir's heritage, and is in alignment with Orientalist notions of India, Indic civilization, so on and so forth. And so once you see that is a kind of framework, an overriding framework that is deeply invested in by both the Dogra court, who's employing Mukundaram Shastri, and by Grierson and others who are, these Orientalist researchers, that you then see, oh, okay, yeah, so even when the archives seem to say something otherwise, you're going to find a way to dismiss that because that doesn't align with the deep framework that you believe is true because you're so deeply invested in this deeper narrative.
My question is how, like when Grierson comes to Kashmir and he meets um uh wh- what's his name? I forgot. What was the name of the guy?
Shastri?
Yeah, Shastri. So when he meets him and the Dogra Empire assigns him, so there's two things at play at that moment. One is Grierson's own Orientalistic idea of Kashmir and the larger narrative that you were talking about. And there's also this Dogra period which want to disseminate an association uh, with the ancient Kashmiri Shaivite culture that had been there for thousands of years. And there's also this project of, I think, the Hindutva project before Hindutva even existed as a term, of the Dogra Empire, where they basically made everything according to what their religion or their idea of religion was at that time. So there's two things at the same time happening. One is Grierson's Orientalistic idea of Kashmir and his larger framework that you talked about. But there's also this concerted effort of Dogras, to appropriate and to create a different narrative of their appropriation of Kashmiri, culture, Kashmiri Hinduism in that sense. So how is this playing out when it comes to Lal Ded? And why did they have to do it? Was it a deliberate attempt because she was still very popular among Kashmiris, Muslims and non-Muslims?
Yeah, well, I think there's multiple things going on. So one, it seems like Lala was continuing to hold a certain kind of popular valence amongst Kashmiris, that she seemed to continue still being revered, that these poems, whether authentically hers or not, I think to the scholarship of John Stratton Hawley writing about Bhakti saints of like North India. And one of the things that he points out is that if you even try to find, what are the authentic poems of Mirabai or someone like that, that then you dig back in the archive, and then when you get close enough to maybe the time when she lived, you are left with, 1, 2, 3 poems at most that we still have. And so you say, oh, okay, so those are the only authentic ones and we throw the rest out. And he argues, no, that's not what we should do. What we should do instead is realize that people are revering a figure and and possibly then saying, oh, what would somebody of this time say? Let me write poetry or write music or write something that then expresses the spirit of this saint I revere. And that then this is recited over and over again, and the people are like, oh, this was what she actually said, and that this canon builds over time. And then kind of reinforces various images and what is revered about this saint, giving words to them. And so I think this is a similar thing that's happened with Lala over the years, that new poetry is added to her canon to both kind of articulate and color who she is in a deeper sort of way, but also speak to the various issues that people see her legacy relating to in any given time period. And so she seems to be popular in this time period, and so bringing her up is important. But I think there's also a side in which Grierson himself, albeit being an Orientalist and having this kind of idea of civilizations and everything that I already mentioned, is also somebody who isn't that into Sanskrit. In fact, as a linguist, he is much more interested in this idea of popular religiosity, that things written in the vernacular are to be valued. So let's stop valuing Sanskrit over the vernaculars. And so this is why he then is, somebody who also enjoys all these bhakti poets, saints, and Mirabai and Surdas and all these people. Grierson is into these people because he's like, yeah, let's get rid of these, in some ways you can say, connected to happenings in Europe, and people saying like, oh, we should go, Christianity, you should adhere to what the earliest things that are written, and people instead then saying, no, we should celebrate folk culture and what are our popular figures. He is feeling that here. And so amongst even Orientalists, he's pushing against the Sanskritists and instead saying, no, we need to celebrate popular vernacular saints. So he's pushing Lala as well. And so when the Dogra court is publishing all of this Sanskrit stuff, but clearly has a kind of ally in Grierson, Grierson is also pushing on that end, saying, no, you should celebrate your vernacular saint. Oh, here's Lal Ded, the one who put these Sanskrit things you're celebrating, oh, but she did it in Kashmiri. So there's another kind of alignment of interests deeply connected there, such that it was only shortly after the Grierson with Mukundaram Shastri and Barnett published the Lala Vakyani that then, as part of the KSTS, the Kashmir series of texts and studies, is this where all of these medieval Sanskrit Shaiva texts are being published. They then publish the kind of quote unquote critical edition of Kashmiri Lala poetry as also a kind of cultural heritage item to be revered. And then these later catalogs of their publications then say, oh yes, all of this Kashmir Shaiva stuff that we have published, this is part of that canon, just a later proponent of them. So it's crafting a world in which Lala is tied to all of these other projects, again, to further various interests, but also bring in the Kashmiri people in some way, that if she is popular amongst them, you also want it to not just be something that is valuable to scholars in their studies, but in fact people out and about. So I think this is how the importance of Lala in this time period for various folks.
I think another question that I have is this research and publication department that was created by the Dogra court. Its focus, like you write in the paper, is the focus. Its focus was on the Hindu religious identity and heritage, in its pursuit of those political aims when the majority of the Kashmir populace was Muslim, and this is at the time when Kashmir has already been through like two major famines. There's a lot of oppression that is documented by Britishers who arrived in Kashmir, and there's also this burgeoning nationalism that is coming about in the late 1890s. With the foundation of Anjuman Nusratul Islam, Young Men Muslim Association at the same time. So, what was the motivation of Dogra Court to push Mukund Ram to publish, this? Because you mentioned in the article, you also mentioned that for 4 years he was collecting it, then his house was burned down, and then he had these letters with Grierson prior to the publication of that, prior to him being asked to write for that. And my I have the two questions I have is, what was the Dogra Court's motivation to create literature at that time? And the second question is, Grierson, Orelstein, who translated Raj Tarangini also in English, they had these, what, like in today's world in journalistic language we will call as fixers. So how responsible do you think were these fixers, given their own agendas or their own politics or their own lens on the Kashmiri society or understanding of these verses? How much of literature that was created by these Orientalists is skewed in that lens? So that's my second question.
Yeah, it's a very important question, and it's you're kind of digging into the kind of deep social and political history of late 19th, early 20th century Kashmir. That's very important for the context of when this is being published, and I will, I guess, say that one of the things that's important is to realize that Mukundaram Shastri himself is a very a figure torn amongst various in various directions. That when I'm digging into the archive, it's very clear that there's various motivations that he or I guess pressures that he's responding to. So one of the things that's very clear is that in Kashmir at the time, and that there was a kind of preference for hiring what are considered, for even the court or for pundits for the court, they would be not preferring Kashmiri pundits. They were preferring Bengalis, those who are tied to the British Empire in the kind of centers of their empire and rule in South Asia. So in fact, one of the, I think the first director of the research and publications department was Chatterjee, this Jagdish Chandra Chatterjee, a Bengali who was brought in. And so you already have this thing where then their underlings are these Kashmiri pundits who are then doing all of this deep, archival and translation work. And so Mukund Ram Shastri is wanting to advance in the department and move further ahead, but is running into difficulties. But then eventually is made a kind of chief of the department because Chatterjee just disappears one day, that he's no longer in Kashmir, he kind of just leaves. And it is found that upon his leaving, that he embezzled large sums of money from the court that should have been going towards the research and publications department and has disappeared. And so in this moment of the court feeling defrauded and feeling that this research and publications department was led by somebody that defrauded them, they did elevate Mukund Ram Shastri to be the chief and then said to him, you need to now make up for your predecessor's embezzlement by publishing way more, way faster, as soon as we can. And then if you do that, then maybe we'll be pleased with you in some way. And so this is happening at the same time when Mukund Ram Shastri and some of these other pundits of the court are working with these other Orientalists on side projects. And of course, the Dogra court wants to continue to have this amicable relationship between departments and individuals working for his court, working with the empire, so that continues to be a friendly relationship, so that his rule and their princely state isn't put up for question. At the same time, they're like, well, then they're diverting their efforts and work to what these Orientalists are doing instead of helping out or doing their main job for the court. So there's all of these different pushes, such that when Mukund Ram Shastri is given an award by the empire of being a great Shastri, as being somebody who is this great scholar, that it's clear that the court tried as best it can to not get him to be recognized by that, because that is, again, giving too much power to this pundit who is supposed to be under the court, and that the court didn't recognize it. Anyway, you can see this dynamic that's already very messy between pundits and Orientalists and the court, and who is grabbing power. But one thing that is clear from reading works like Hindu Rulers, Muslim Subjects by Mridhu Rai, that the Dogra court itself was also invested in producing this Kashmiri heritage to support their rule, at the same time of making sure that the general Muslim population is kept under thumb, to continue to use begari, forced non-paid labor of the Muslim population, keep the Muslim population as peasants as much as possible. And so, even though the Kashmiri pundits in the court are struggling against all sorts of pressures and forces that are seeking to push them down, at the very least, they are also invested. I don't want to become like those Muslim peasants, that we are at least above them. So this hierarchy and the pressures in keeping the hierarchy, that Mukund Ram Shastri also seems invested in him and pundits continuing to hold somewhat of a privileged position vis-a-vis the Muslim population, who is the lowest rung for that, or at least lower on the social hierarchy. So these are also investments at the time, that then Lala and publishing on Lala is coming in the middle of all of that. And so you can see why, publications out there and getting, a translation in English of Lala's poetry, such that people in the UK and maybe others in the English-speaking world saying, oh, this is some great poetry. Oh, who did this work? Where did this come from? Oh, we want to, we want more of that. We want to say that those people that produce those things are great, are reasons why Kashmiris, the Dogras, the Orientals, everyone is invested in kind of publishing these things and putting them forward.
Okay, coming to the last part of our podcast is, you mentioned in 1950s when the deputy director of the research and publications department of the post Dogra rule, Sahibzada Hassan Shah, he writes a very beautiful tribute on Lala. And my question is, to both you and Shakir is, if despite the politics of Lal Ded that happened in the 19th century or earlier 20th century, she still has a massive reverence to the point that I was really surprised that in Bijbihara, I had sent a picture to both of you of the shrine that only women go to, and it's a shrine of that pays tribute to Lala Ded, as a woman, and people seek her blessings, and these are mostly Muslim women who go into these shrines. So, so, so both in terms of an academic understanding and also from a societal understanding, uh, how is Lal Ded seen by contemporary Kashmiri writers post 1950 after the end of the Dogra rule? First to Dean and then to Shakir. So before we end the podcast.
This is a question that I struggle a little bit to answer because I'm not an anthropologist. I'm not, and I have, spent time in Kashmir, but not a lot. So I think both of you could probably speak more towards her popularity or reverence today. But I'll say a couple of different things. I mean, one, that she clearly seems to be playing into issues around heritage and what is Kashmir's heritage, and pundits and versus Muslims, and who is she really, and so on. There's a kind of contention that can be there that plays into all sorts of kind of Hindu nationalist politics, and yet also just like at a popular level, she is this kind of powerful female figure, even though she's associated with Nund Rishi and others, and she's considered an independent woman, somebody who's kind of power resides in herself, not because of her connection to a man, not a husband, not her father, not whatever, that she herself generated some greatness that's to be revered. And I'm in some ways frankly surprised that people continue to revere her, given how much she has been reappropriated by various rulers, kings, so on and so forth, to even by Narendra Modi, when he's visited, he'll like invoke people like Lala, that you would then think at a certain point, you would say, I don't want anything to do with her anymore, because it seems like all of these politicians are invoking her, so I don't want to have any association with her anymore. And yet she still seems to have a certain type of popular valence. And that gives me, in some ways, some hope that, with all history or with all, figures of the past, that they can be reimagined and retooled and redeployed for the people in a useful way. And I think that Lala is a figure that can be reimagined in those ways and speak to people's suffering and desires and kind of inner voice, that I think she can and should be used and brought forward till today, if that's useful for people.
And I would like to chime in this question, because Faisal asked if why is she so relevant in today's modern contemporary social media. The fact is that Lal Ded is holds the same reverence that other saints. The whole is the whole advent of Islamic hate culture, the popularization of the saints, and entombing, enshrining them in the places, and then turning them into a shrine. This whole paradigm was designed to sort of cultivate a kind of culture where people are relying on these saints, on the spiritual legacies of these saints. They are absorbed, they are imbibed, so that there could be some kind of social coherence, spiritual coherence to the people, and it's a whole pantheon. Uh, it's a whole pantheon rather than just one person. So Lalla is one of among the many in this case. So I think for Muslims, she has never been an exception. She is just one of the many saints. But what makes her special is the woman who is who is there, and who makes her presence felt. And that is more relevant to the Kashmiris, because they think that her the kind of language of even though among Muslims, I mean, her poetry is not really very kind of very popular the way it is among the Kashmiri Pandits, but her legacy, it is the legacy that connects her to the Sufi saints. Sort of these stories, these hagiographic accounts that act as that that act as sort of some mediation, that perform this act of mediating between the Kubrawi, the Central Asian Sufis, and the local figures. So I think the larger issue is to glue this together, the glue this entire paradigm, entire framework together of different saints that Kashmir's spiritual terrain, this spiritual domain is bookmarked with. So I think it's to glue that together, and it is in this process that Lalla emerges as an indispensable figure. But like I said, among Muslims, she is. I don't think she's much different from the saints that are there, from Nundrishi or Baba Bhamuddin or Latifuddin or others. She's just revered as much as they are. But among pundits, I think she has acquired a degree of exceptionalism over the last century. But I think that has again to do with a lot how the politics, that process is deeply enmeshed with the Dogra court politics also, because this reinventing of Lalla, the reinvention of Lalla, is not a standalone incident. It happens side by side with other things as well. Like Chitralekha Zuchi in her book Contested Past, she gives a reference to how Raj Tarangini itself was deracinated from its original context. Rather than reading Raj Tarangini as a book that talks about the history of Kashmir, rather than it being peculiar to Kashmir, we have a discursive 19th century. We see a discursive remodeling of Raj Tarangini as a document, as an artifact that instantiates Kashmir's seminal ties with this quote unquote Indic civilization, rather than understand the Raj Tarangini as a document that is peculiar and that is particular to Kashmir. Similarly, we see Ronald Enden in his book Querying the Material. I think that's the name of the book. Yeah, I hope I'm not being incorrect. That book also talks about how the two additional texts, Nilmata Purana as well as the Vishnu Dharmottara Purana, these were also reinterpreted in the 19th century as the texts that sort of connect Kashmir to the wider Hindu Indic earth, rather than again being the texts that are very specific to Kashmir and its local, the modalities of kingship and the narratives and the discursive exercises associated with the kingship particular to Kashmir. So this complete remodeling, this complete reinvention of the texts and historical books, every discursive material that has been written throughout the history appears to be picking up pace only in 19th century, particularly after the Dogra Empire takes over. So I think it is all about how, now that we had the end of the Sultanate period, after the Sikh, I think that there is a concerted effort to sort of present to sort of present Muslim rule as a sort of intrusion, something that has just disrupted the Kashmir's history from its original root, which is the history which is grounded in the Hindu philosophy, the pure Hindu philosophy, and that's how this land came about. So, but at the end of the day, it's good that we have more and more scholarship, there is this. Ananya Jahara Kabir's The Territory of Desire, and other books that are coming, which are actually dealing with the subject and telling us how this project is actually, it is enmeshed, it is connected with the wider politics of the Dogra Code and has little to do with actual history of the region. Over to
Dean?
you, Dean.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that you said that I think is very important is that, if I can kind of go back, one thing that's Muhammad Ali Reina said in his Tazkirat al-Arifin about Lala is that it said that even though she never left Kashmir itself, she was born and raised in Kashmir, that she knew the spiritual status of every saint that has ever lived, past, present, and future. And to me, this is fascinating because there's a way in which she then figures as there's so many pressures for Kashmiri Muslims coming from outside saying this is what proper Islam is and you're not doing it right here, that these are the real traditions, yours is the wrong traditions. And then likewise for Kashmiri pundits, around the world are being told, this is what Hinduism is. These are the true traditions. What you were doing was some strange aberration. Maybe it was because you spent so long with Muslims or whatever. That Lala becomes this figure of like, she is one of our own. She is Kashmiri through and through. She is, and that even though she never left Kashmir, she already knows all the stuff that's happening everywhere else, and she has told us the right way to do it. And so I think she also stands as a figure of like, she is one of our own. We don't need to be told from the outside what our tradition is. We have it in our own grasp, and this is a value of her. And I think the Rishi saints as well, of being like, we don't need outside stuff. We have it here, and therefore we can revere these figures as one of our own, and without having to keep looking out elsewhere outside for legitimacy. That there is a Kashmiri way, or various Kashmiri ways of being, and that we should value these instead of setting them aside for some other hegemonic form.
On that beautiful note, Dean and Shakir, thank you very much for being on the podcast.
Thanks for listening to Sultanat by Museum of Kashmir.